love of wheels and engines and explosions. I'm not arguing that Tolkien was directly influenced by Milton, he might have been, but rather that his version of the sublime, of the power of obscurity, is recognisably Burkean. It's through Burke's understanding of Milton. And I think this is an important point for several reasons, which I'll outline and then go into in a little more depth. For Burke, Walpole, and later Gothic writers, the sublime signalled the limits of rationality. This is, of course, Goya, the sleep of reason. And it was best communicated by the obscure. So the profoundly suggestive obscurity of terror and power became a crucial activity of the Gothic imagination. And Burke's work was almost like a manifesto, almost like an agenda for later Gothic writers. And I've proposed 7 types of obscurity that exemplify Gothic aesthetics, which I'll give you in a moment. It's also important to understand that the sublime became a fundamental constituent of a particularly political form of literature, of the Whig party, the Liberal party. So this way of writing wasn't independent of party politics at the time. Poetic creativity, the sublime, had a strong political significance. The Tory writers, the royalist writers, were imitators. They imitated classical writers. Theirs was a craft. They saw themselves as members of the court, as Augustans, engaged in social and political commentary and satire. The Whig writers, the liberal writers, were melancholy, reclusive, looked like they were living in other worlds. They were enthralled by the ancient past, intoxicated with the powers of the imagination. And so we get the Whig intellectual, the Earl of Shaftesbury, describing how poetry is a divine, God-given activity. He says the poet is indeed a second maker, a just Prometheus. Remember, Prometheus stole fire. So the poet steals fire under Jove. Like that sovereign artist or universal plastic, that's palpable nature, he forms a whole, coherent and proportioned in itself, with due subjection and subordinacy of constituent parts. This sounds very like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantic poet, writing more than a century later, that the poet diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. So the Romantic emphasis on originality and creativity, which you've all seen, I think, in Frankenstein, was directly derived from the previous century's politics of creativity, writing seen as a form of commerce, of entrepreneurship. In terms of Tolkien, while we might think of Fëanor, who created the Silmarils, as a Promethean artist-creator, similar to the Romantic genius, he also draws, therefore, on a much longer tradition, identifiable in Shaftesbury, also Neoplatonic thinking and philosophy, the tragic heroes of Shakespeare, of ancient Greece, and the covetous materialism in biblical parables of the New Testament. So this way of making the imagination powerful and creative is itself dramatically evident in the 18th century in the attention given to the sublime as an effect which is linked to freedom and lack of restraint and rebellion. So I hope you're sort of seeing how it overlaps now with the way in which the Gothic race were imagined politically. In fact, the first English version of Longinus's treatise on the sublime had appeared in 1652, in other words, just after the British Civil Wars, as the work of a Republican poet and writer. So even then, the idea of the sublime is being equated, it's being linked with Republican government and Commonwealth, in other words, with the extreme left wing of politics. And other critics have charted the relationship between poetic passion, originality, and the spontaneous in the work of later critics. So Burke's work on the sublime is supporting this Whig attitude towards politics and creativity, and that's what influences later writers. So the sublime, like the Gothic, is a political element of the period. Or to put it another way, the theory and practice of the sublime underlines and emphasises the political basis of the Gothic. And that, I would argue, runs deep in Tolkien's work. Now, the 7 types of obscurity I mentioned earlier might be summed up like this, and this is what I've derived from Burke, and I think that it applies to a lot of Gothic writing, and I'm going to look at it in particular in Tolkien's work. So we could have meteorological obscurity. In other words, mists, clouds, wind, rain, storm, tempest, smoke, darkness, shadows, and gloom. Gothic novels are sort of full of this bad weather, if you like. In Tolkien, we have obviously the misty mountains. We have mist on the road to Bucklebury Ferry. We have fog on the Barrow Downs. We have Weathertop and the storm there. The great darkness on the Plenary fields. Secondly, there's topographical obscurity. In other words, an obscure landscape. Impenetrable forests, inaccessible mountains, chasms, gorges, deserts, blasted heaths and moors, ice fields, or the boundless ocean. Again, those are elements that you'll recognise from your reading of Gothic novels. Tolkien, too, has this topographical obscurity. Mirkwood and the Old Forest, Caradhras, the Dead Marshes, Thangorodrim, and the idea of the uttermost west. Thirdly, architectural obscurity. In other words, buildings that complicate and make things difficult for characters. Towers, prisons, castles covered in gargoyles and ramparts, abbeys and priories, tombs, crypts, dungeons, ruins, graveyards, mazes, secret passages, locked doors. All of these are recognisable in Gothic novels. Many examples in Tolkien as well. Dol Guldur, where the necromancer is revealed to be Sauron. Minas Morgul, Barad-dûr, Sauron's great fortress. Angband, Moria, Orthanc, the Paths of the Dead, the Barrows, Shelob's Lair, the tunnels under the Misty Mountains, and so forth. Material obscurity. That would mean masks and veils or disguises, or even suits of armour. The Nazgul, obviously, as well as Frodo travelling under an assumed name, Mr. Underhill. Strider, who is known as Aragorn and later Elessar. The elven cloaks of Lothlorien. Eowyn's disguise as Dernhelm. Frodo and Samwise disguised as orcs. Or in the Silmarillion, Beren and Luthien disguised as a werewolf and a vampire bat. Fifth would be textual obscurity, how the text itself entangles the reader or confuses the reader. Riddles, rumours, folklore, the use of unreadable manuscripts and inscriptions, broken texts, unfinished stories, unreliable narrators, and so forth. Stories within stories. Now, philology, invented languages, are of course at the heart of Tolkien's Middle-earth. In addition, he also has what you could call textual objects, textual artefacts. Thorin's map with the moon runes on it. The prophetic song, The King Beneath the Mountains, which is sung at Lake Town when the dwarves and Bilbo arrive. The inscription on the ring, which Frodo cannot read. The manuscript of Isildur that Gandalf discovers. The book of Mezabel, found in Moria. More complex examples would be the long, unfinished poems that Tolkien refers to, and the different languages and dialects of Middle-earth, and references in Lord of the Rings not only to the First Age, but also to Anglo-Saxon poetry and other sources. Spiritual obscurity would be another type. Religious mystery, allegory, symbolism, ritual, magic and the occult, Satanism, witchcraft, summonings and damnation. Now, this is a staple of Gothic fiction, particularly for those of you who have read The Monk, but perhaps offers less for the reader of Tolkien. Now, while there's certainly damnation and forms of magic being exercised, as well as some limited attention to burial rites, the supernatural is surprisingly downplayed. There's very little about religion or about forms or places of worship. Where are the churches in Middle-earth? Well, they're on Numenor. If anyone's read the Silmarillion is where the temples are built. But religion's a tricky area, and I'll return to that in my conclusion. And magic itself is pretty downplayed in Middle-earth. Sauron does change his shape, and the dragons have powers of bewitchment, as does Saruman. The two Watchers are the enchanted guardians of Cirith Ungol, but there isn't a great deal. And finally, psychological obscurity can be seen to characterize the Gothic novel. Dreams, visions, hallucinations, drugs, sleepwalking, madness, split personalities, mistaken identities, doubles, derangement, ghostly presences, forgetfulness, and hauntings. Now, obviously, there's plenty for Tolkien readers here. Prophetic dreams, the visions of the Plenary, which also enslaves users to the will of Sauron, the mirror of Galadriel, the shifts in perception caused by the ring, the split identities of Gollum, Smeagol, multi-named characters, derangement, the effect of the ring not only on its bearers, but also on other characters such as Boromir, ghosts, again, the ring wraiths, Barrow Wights, Oathbreakers, forgetfulness, as seen by the character Nienor in The Children of Húrin, and the distorted vision of Morgoth imposed on Húrin himself. Now, this long list I've just given is by no means definitive, and you could write on any of those topics, as well as other topics such as monstrosity, the dragon, the Watcher in the Water, Shelob, and so forth. But these forms of obscurity all aim at creating a sublime experience through mystification, through confusion, in order to think about the consequences of history and the telling of secrets. In other words, they're all tied to history. They're not existing independently. Let's take the last example. The devastating plot of The Children of Húrin, for those who've read it, is driven by exposing dreadful secrets in the revelation of the past, and that secret is incest. And so suggested by The Children of Húrin, the Gothic, through its fascination with gloom and ineffability, the license allowed to the imagination, and the tendency of the sublime to engage with violence and terror and horror, it becomes a way of exploring those forbidden subjects, of exploring incest, or confronting the ferocity of the French Revolution in the 1790s, or giving voice to panic about scientific advance in Frankenstein, or expressing revulsion over racism and slavery in a more recent novel such as Beloved by Toni Morrison. And Tolkien's own concerns fit these deeper currents in his heartfelt anxieties over the irrevocable rural and industrial change, over the deep struggles of national identity after the First and Second World Wars, and the dehumanizing effects of mechanized warfare, that being the major experience of the 20th century. Now, all this is seen most emphatically, I think, in the downfall of Numenor, the Akalabeth. It's a text dominated by his fear of death, of mortality, but also of progress and memory. From its founding, Numenor had a temple to Ilúvatar, at whose feet were built the tombs of the kings. And so death and memorialization are at the heart of the Numenorian identity. And the Numenorians valued learning, arts and crafts. They remained friends with the elves, who brought them songbirds and flowers and trees and herbs and corn and wine. But even so, they protested against their mortality and the prohibition against them visiting the Undying Land, as they thought they would become deathless if they could set foot on Valinor. Sauron fed their lust for immortal life. He corrupted 3 Numenorian kings